Hello, everybody, and welcome again to Deep Humanism. And I'm here, as so often, with Andrew Copson of Humanists UK. How are you doing, Andrew?
I'm very well, enjoying the sunshine.
It's a glorious day as we record, so we're going to record this as quickly as possible so we can go and lay outside and get better tans
Like
than at
lizards.
least my vampiric complexion.
Oh, I think you look lovely.
Why, thank you. I appreciate it. Today, we are talking about a court case that is currently being considered by the US Supreme Court. It is the case of St. Isidore, a virtual Catholic charter school that was approved in Oklahoma by Oklahoma's Charter School Board in 2023. Now, just so you know what a charter school is in America, it is a state-funded school, so it's funded by taxpayers. It's not a private school, but it has rather more autonomy in how it teaches and what it teaches than normal state schools. So it's giving state schools a bit more opportunity to shape their curriculum way of teaching to fit a particular community. They're often run by charities or non-profit organizations, but not by explicitly religious ones, because as Oklahoma's Supreme Court decided, that could be damaging to the separation between church and state, because effectively the government would then be directly funding an explicitly religious organization, which in America is a big no-no. So the Oklahoma Charter School Board in 2023 said, yes, you can set up this virtual Catholic charter school. Then a bunch of civil society organizations brought a suit that says, no, you can't. That's against the separation of church and state. Oklahoma's Supreme Court agreed and blocked the school from opening because it said it violated the state's constitution. And then the school appealed to the Supreme Court, and now America's Supreme Court is considering whether they will allow this virtual Catholic charter school to open. Did I do a decent job in explaining that?
I think that's a perfect explanation, absolutely perfect. The only thing I would add, of course, is that the Supreme Court agreeing to hear the case is quite significant. They don't have to agree it. So, I think it's a significant step they've taken. They would only agree to hear it, I think, if they wanted to make some change to the settled law or thought that some change to the settled law might be arguable, which in itself is very shocking.
So you say it's very shocking. I mean, maybe outline what you think, what your view is of this case and why you think it's important to talk about.
Well, I mean, the American Constitution has said from its very beginning, that no officers in the state should be subject to religious tests, and from the very beginning, therefore, it's had a secular constitution. And then, of course, the First Amendment very clearly, it was very early on in the American Constitution's history. It says, there can't be any establishment of a religion, there can't be any um, suppression of religious freedom, and although these concepts have been subject to lots of litigation over the centuries it is now, and the pendulum has swung forward and backwards in terms of how strict that state secularism has been. Really, the state funding religious education, religious schools, has been nowhere on that agenda. It's been completely taboo. It's been completely beyond the possibility. Even when the pendulum has swung in American constitutional history in the anti-secular direction, it's never swung as far as this. So it would genuinely be novel if if a US school would be funded, even though it's religious. And I think I'm not saying it would be a surprise, because the trajectory has been very clear the last few years, most notably under the justices that Donald Trump has appointed, and the decisions that they've made, is that secularism in the United States, I won't go so far as to say it's over, but constitutionally it has been all but eliminated. And I think this would be the death knell for it, actually. I wrote a book in the very short introduction series in OUP, Oxford, the little very short introduction books in Oxford University Press about.
It's a great book.
It's a great series. In 2018, and that was obviously during the first Trump presidency, and I wrote at the end of that, when I was surveying sort of the current situation in the current secular states like France, like Turkey, like India, like the US. I said it's on a knife edge in all these places, and now I think I've got to revise that book quite soon for a second edition, because they like to keep the series up to date. And I think I would have to say now it's close to over rather than on a knife edge, and that's very depressing. It reminds us that secularism isn't automatic, that it has to be hard fought for, that it has to be defended. We'll perhaps talk more about why this has happened and the causes of the decline of American secularism. But I do certainly think that if this case is decided in the non-secular way, that it is possibly a death knell for secularism in the US Constitution. What does it mean otherwise? What does non-establishment mean and not promoting religion mean if it doesn't, at the very, very least, mean not literally paying for the promotion of religion in your public services?
It does seem to be a big red line that has historically not been crossed that may well be being crossed. And just to give people a sense of how serious this is in comparison to other potential breaches, I remember when I was leading an ethical society, so humanist congregation, which weirdly in America is considered a religious non-profit, right? So we were a religious non-profit organization, and there was a state program that allowed schools to apply for funding to rebuild their playgrounds. And the nursery school that we run out of the premises of the congregation wanted to apply for this state funding to resurface our playground for our kids. And I had to say no, because that would constitute the state giving money directly to a religious organization in law to pay for an aspect of an educational service we offered. And so we didn't even think it was appropriate to apply, let alone, apply.
And then self-restrained of you.
Well, yes. Well, because we take secularism seriously, right? And we recognize that it's a slippery slope, but that's even just getting a bit of money from the state for something like a repair.
Yeah.
We didn't think that was acceptable. This would be the wholesale funding of an entirely new school that's explicitly religious. So it would be a massive series of steps beyond that. I guess before we talk about how this has come to happen, because I think it is an interesting story, it might be worth saying why we think secularism is good. Like, why is it actually bad? Because one of the things I know that the school is arguing, and its supporters in response to this, is the school is already massively oversubscribed. There are hundreds of families who want to go to it. These sorts of schools are clearly very desirable among some sectors of the community. So why shouldn't the state seek to fulfill that need by giving money to open a religious school?
Well, you could easily argue that it could. You could easily argue that a state would still be secular if, for example, it provided funding on an equal basis to all groups. That is a possible sort of argument for a sort of secularism, and some countries historically have done that, like, for example, the Netherlands or Belgium even today. They argue that the equal funding of religious and humanist groups to provide state schools, state education, or education within state schools in some cases, is actually a type of secularism. I think it is, therefore arguable. I don't think it's arguable for very long, because most state systems, when they get into trying to argue that this is secularism, run into a lot of problems. Like, for example, what about when new religious groups come along? How are you really going to treat them equally? What about splits within religious groups? If there's a religious group that only 4 parents are a member of, is the state going to fund that? If not, what are the criteria going to be? Are they going to be criteria of size? In that case, that seems very arbitrary. How are you going to control the curriculum? Are there standards that you're willing to have broken by religious schools in the name of the freedom that you're allowing them within those schools? What is a religious school really? Is it something to do with the employment of staff? Is it something to do with the admission of pupils? Is it something to do with the content of the curriculum? And very soon the states that try to say that equal treatment, by which they mean equal privileging of religious and humanist groups in the education system, is the type of secularism, quickly run into trouble in practice. And I think that therefore there's a big pragmatic argument that says just don't get into all of that. Let parents, let civil society, let the third sector, let religion and belief institutions themselves deal with their business, and let education, where it is going to be state funded, be secular, because the secular education that's delivered can be the education that we all share. And that brings us to what secularism is. And secularism is a moral commitment on the part of the state to uphold freedom of conscience for all people to the maximum possible extent, whilst holding them together in a shared civic identity. It means that people shouldn't be privileged or discriminated against for their religion or belief. It means the state should try and maximise freedom of religion and belief for all people, and it means that there shouldn't be any domination of the state by religious or belief interests, or vice versa. I think the second element of secularism, as I've just described, actually is also relevant to education. So when I say that the state a secular state should guarantee the most possible religious freedom for most people, of course, that does include children.
Yes.
Children are human beings too, although sometimes their parents may doubt it, or the law may treat them as possessions of their parents. Children are human beings, and so they also deliver the maximum. They also deserve the maximum possible freedom of religion or belief. And can a religious school really provide that? Is a religious school really an example of the state doing its duty by children to guarantee them that maximum possible freedom of religion or belief? So there's lots of in-principle reasons for secularism, many more than I've even just stated. There's also that pragmatic reason of just, well, where would it end actually? You know, how could you really guarantee? How could a secularism that said that it was secular because it gave everyone equal privilege really deliver that in practice,
Yes.
when it would be subject to so much fissure and division and granularity of funding that it wouldn't really be possible? And you know, that's the abstract, but the American reason, you know, the origin of secularism in the American Constitution is so that people will be free. You know, it comes out of the desire to avoid the Anglican establishment that was at the point of the American Revolution in force, at least in this country and in some states of what became the United States. You know, and that was a situation where you couldn't get a full education, you couldn't go to university, you couldn't hold public office, you know, restricted in all sorts of ways if you weren't an Anglican Protestant. And so the American dream, the American promise in the Constitution is that will never happen again. You know, your life chances, your education, all of these things will never be subject to your religion or the religion of your parents. And you know, that's a good ideal, and I think it can only be guaranteed in practice in an education system that is secular.
I feel like you've given three really good reasons there, and just to kind of sum them up for our listeners, we've got a sort of set of pragmatic reasons. If we imagine that the Supreme Court comes through with a ruling, we're expecting it this summer, saying, okay, yes, you can use state money to set up this religious charter school. Well, you can imagine immediately what's going to happen next, which is every religious group will want to set up their charter school. And in principle, there's no limit to how many religious groups there can possibly be. I mean, there's already hundreds, and there could be infinite. I mean, anyone can make a new religion tomorrow if they want to. And so at some point, the state is not going to be able to meet all the requests of all the different religious groups that ask for a school. And then it's going to have to get into the difficult process of saying who gets one and who doesn't on some set of criteria.
And it'll end up prioritising the powerful.
Yes, almost certainly the bigger groups that can lobby or organise faster or, you know, have more resources to argue their case will be benefited. And it will become a huge mess. I mean, what happens when the Oklahoma branch of the Church of Satan decides that they want their school, which they will? Then what's going to happen? Are they going to let them do it? Well, they sort of have to if they go down this route. But if they don't, then they're doing direct religious discrimination against one group and not another. It's just a whole can of worms that you don't want to really open. So better for the government to just say, no, we don't do this at all. And I think that's a good pragmatic reason. And then you had the in principle reasons about religious freedom, which is once you start, the government's very powerful. It's powerful in terms of the resources it has. It's powerful in terms of it reserves physical force, you know, the force of the military and the police to itself. So it has sorts of power that civil society organizations just don't have. And it's powerful in a sort of cultural or ideological sense, in the sense that what the state chooses to support gains its implicit endorsement. And it would be intriguing to think, it's interesting that this is a Catholic school asking for this. I mean, that's got to, if the state says, yes, you can do it, well, that feels like a weird sort of endorsement of Catholicism to some degree, or at least people could take it in that way. And that, in the realm of religion, where how people make their decisions is about all sorts of cultural factors which sway people towards one religion or another, the finger of the state can really push down the scales in a way that undermines religious freedom. And then particularly I'm really passionate about the fact that, I'm glad you raised it, children are human beings. They have rights, including rights to the autonomy of their minds. They have a right to a religious education that enables them to make an informed choice about how to live out their religious and spiritual lives, whether that means being religious or not religious, or whichever religion is appealing to them. And I don't think that you can really access that right without a broad-based education that gives you religious options and trains you in religious literacy and shows you that there are many different religions. Is St. Isidore Catholic Charter School going to do that? Is it really going to teach a lot about Hinduism and Islam and humanism? I doubt it. And that is the real danger here, I think, is that young people will receive a skewed education like they would in a Catholic private school. And that, I think, is really upsetting because it undermines. I think there is a real inconsistency at the heart of the argument of those who say, well, allowing this sort of school to go ahead is itself a matter of religious freedom, because religious freedom means being able to choose freely between different options, and you cannot deny your children that opportunity in the name of your own religious freedom.
Exactly.
That's completely incoherent. And so I worry about that. And then your third reason, you had a third reason. There was a third set of reasons.
I'm surprised there were only 3. I thought there were a lot more. But anyway.
Well, I was putting them into buckets: a pragmatic, a principled, and a sort of American one. Which is that this is a traditional reading of the American Constitution and of American history says this is not allowed. This is not the way that America has traditionally handled the relationship between religion and state. It would be a very big deviation.
I mean, that's not a good reason, necessary argument for tradition,
but it's rhetorically powerful. So let's mobilize it.
Well, it should at least be examined. I mean, people should at least be aware that this is, because there's a lot of lying about American history today that takes place, especially within the movement that's allied itself with President Trump. J.D. Vance likes to talk about Thomas Jefferson as if he was an Orthodox Christian. Nothing could be further from the truth, really. And likes to talk about America having been founded as a Christian nation and so on. Again, rubbish. And so I think that it's a good argument, at least from the point of view that Americans should at least think seriously about it, because it's, if they want to break the wall of separation between church and state, they should at least do it knowingly, rather than just be told somehow that this is sometime in the relatively recent past, contrary to the intention of the founders, secularism was built as an anti-Christian bias into the system, and that now it must at last be demolished so that Americans can be free as the founders intended again. That's rubbish. And so at least Americans should realise that and not go into this under a false prospectus.
That leads me to ask about one of the arguments which the defenders of the school have been putting forward, which is the idea that to allow secular non-profit organizations to run charter schools, which is basically who runs charter schools right now, secular non-profit organizations, but not allow religious non-profit organizations to do so, is itself religious discrimination. It's saying, well, we won't fund you because your non-profit is religious, but you, not religious non-profit, you can get funding from the state to run a school. What do you think about that argument?
I mean, I think that's obvious nonsense, because the opposite of a religious group is a non-religious group, a group that has a non-religious outlook. The opposite of a religious group is not a secular group. I mean, a secular group is the opposite of both a religious and an explicitly non-religious group. Secular civil society organisations or education providers do what they do on the basis of principles that are completely unrelated to religiosity or non-religiosity, and I think that's the correct distinction, at least in constitutional and human rights law terms. I mean, there may be, one might be able to disagree with what I said as intellectually and conceptually. In fact, I would, partly disagree with myself conceptually, intellectually as well, because I don't necessarily believe everything that I say. But it's arguable. It's arguable. But if we were just discussing these things in the abstract, what I've just said, but I don't think it's arguable in constitutional and human rights law terms. Otherwise, those laws just wouldn't make sense. So I think to say, it reminds me of the of what we used to get told by the BBC at Humanist UK. When we used to go to the BBC and we used to say, we still do, not used to, we're still doing it. Go to the BBC and say, there are hundreds of hours of Christian worship on your channels, Christians speaking Christianity to Christians through the public service broadcaster, and no humanists speaking humanism to humanists, or Muslims speaking Islam to Muslims, so on and so forth. You're a public body. Although you exist in a Christian state formally, you do have obligations to be impartial and to provide on a fair basis different types of program. When are you going to provide some analogy to these hours of Christian broadcasting? And the BBC would say, when they were having a bad day, this wasn't their best argument, but it was an argument that came up a lot. What do you mean? 95% of our output is secular. EastEnders is secular, a soap opera. Gardener's World is secular. And we would go back to them and say, we think you've missed the point. Because the point is not that, I think the analogy is clear. The opposite of religious broadcasting, i.e. Christians speaking Christianity to Christians through the airwaves, is not EastEnders, which everyone could enjoy, if you like that sort of thing. The non-religious analogy would be, for example, humanists speaking humanism to humanists, or nihilists speaking nihilism to nihilists, if you want to go that way, or whatever. Marxists speaking Marxism to Marxists, if you view that as a sort of religious view or whatever. So, I think that's pretty obvious. So I hope that there are.
I agree with you.
It'd be a very bad precedent.
It's interesting, though, that in my experience, just as your experience with the BBC, people often have a difficulty in appreciating what secularism actually means, which is one of the reasons why everyone should read your book, of course. But it's not explicitly atheistic.
No,
it's
exactly.
A secular school is not one that teaches people not to be religious. That is a common misunderstanding, I think, or a secular TV program is not one that advocates, atheism and non-religion. It's just doesn't have any particular religious or non-religious stance and tries to create a space where it's essentially neutral. It's neutral vis-a-vis religion. That's the ideal, at least.
At least it's indifferent.
Yeah. It tries not to promote any particular perspective on matters of religion, spirituality, faith, etc. And that is a sort of procedural understanding of what secularism is that I think a lot of people just don't understand. And they will be taken in by an argument that says, but all these non-profits that don't have a religious character can run schools, so why shouldn't ones that do have a religious character? Because that would be fair, because you've got the non-religious ones and then you can have the religious ones. But the quotes non-religious ones are just, they don't really have anything to do with religion, and they're not promoting non-religion.
Yeah, exactly.
The difference would be if American atheists had a charter school, right? And they were teaching children to be atheists with public money. That would be, and then they said, oh, no, you can't have your Catholic school. Well, then there may be a case there. But that is not what happened. So it is, I think, a mistaken argument.
Right. I mean, so, for example, the analogy with the UK or with some other jurisdictions that have their secular public schools teach about religions and beliefs. They live that as it were, impartial version of secularity. They try to they can't teach about everything, but they try to teach about different religions and beliefs, which is a sort of historical evolution of the school sort of subject that used to be Christian instruction, but now is by law about different religions and humanism. And that's a secular school. That's a proper business of a secular school. And then a religious school wants to promote its own particular sort of religion, one way or another, implicitly or explicitly, and that is the non-secular. That's what makes it non-secular, and therefore, in the American context, in the context of a state that is committed to secularism in all its public activity, it's something that shouldn't be funded. But I think it's useful to think about why it's happening, because I think it's hard to see it as any other. It's not as if this is the first time that religious groups have tried to start charter schools or to get state funding for their activities. It's been going on for, they've tried many times all over the United States, and people have tried to unwind secularism all across the United States in many times since it began, many times and ways since it began. So I think it's significant to ask why it's happening now. Why is the Supreme Court doing that? Made this decision now, and I think the answer is pretty. I don't not suggest we spend much time on this because I think the answer is pretty clear. It's that the movement that has coalesced around Donald Trump and his presidency is explicitly committed to the re-engineering of the American state away from impartial secularism and towards Christian nationalism. And I think that's just how it is. And Catholic denominations are playing a very significant role in that. Obviously, the Vice President himself is a Catholic convert, but also, as we know, Donald Trump got the vast majority of the Catholic vote in his election. And specifically Catholic moral doctrines often make their way into the Christian nationalist program, in a way, like think about the obsession with abortion, for example, or same-sex marriage, where other denominations of Christian are a bit more relaxed, about some of these things than Roman Catholics tend to be. So I think that, I think that's the explanation. I don't think it's anything more interesting than that, but it is just highly significant that it's happening. And I hope that the problem with this is that Supreme Court judgment. I spoke earlier about the pendulum that Supreme Court case law has resembled over the history of American secularism, and that's true. But you feel now like the undoing of secularism that we have is not really like the swing of a pendulum, but more like a ratchet. Something that can't be come back from, because it's hard to think with some of the case law that is being established now. It's hard to see how it could be undone in the normal. Well, I mean, courts can always find, Supreme Courts especially all over the world, can always find some bullshit reason to undo. This case is slightly different from the last one, therefore we change everything. That's what a court often does. But this case, it just feels like it'd be another one of those type of ratchet cases where you sort of, how could you ever argue in the future that the funding of religious schools is unconstitutional if the Supreme Court in this case finds some legal reasoning to explain why it isn't? And that doesn't feel like something you can come back from. That's why this feels different from previous sort of swinging back and forth that American secularism through its case law has had.
I think you're right about that, and that makes it a particularly scary case because, as you say, if this goes through and they're allowed to establish this school with public money, then to reverse it would mean essentially to shut down a bunch of charter schools, effectively, which is difficult to imagine that happening. And obviously it will open the floodgates all over the place for religious organizations to run schools, and so many will be ready to want to do this. And I think that talking about the reasons why this is happening is very important, because I think people might not appreciate, particularly if they're in the UK context, how sinister this is and how I want to say dishonest the whole campaign is, because presenting this as, oh, we're just a religious organization that wants to run a school just like all these non-religious organizations want to run a school, and it's not fair on us that we're not allowed, suggests that they're the party who's being discriminated against and treated poorly. But my experience of 15 years in America, much of it spent fighting and lobbying against all sorts of attempts by religious organizations to further embed Christian privilege in state schools, is that they're very aware that schools are a very useful cultural battleground and resource that they want to control, and they are willing to try and exert control over public schools in all sorts of nefarious ways that are sometimes quite transparent. To give you an example, there was a bill in Missouri that I was part of a coalition fighting against, which wanted to introduce a class into their state schools about teaching the Bible, and only the Bible and no other religious texts.
Sounds like Northern Ireland.
It's just that they wanted to do that. And so in order to try and illustrate what sort of attempt this was, so the argument was, well, it's an important historical document and you can't understand all sorts of other things without understanding the Bible and all this stuff. So a Democratic representative introduced an amendment that said we can teach the Bible alongside scriptural texts of other traditions and non-religious philosophical texts. and they voted that one down. They were like, no, we won't have that amendment. We just want to teach the Bible. And that's how transparent
Yeah.
their attempts tend to be
Yeah.
to turn state-funded schools into spaces for the incubation of the Christian religion. That's really what they want them to be. And it's already in a context where a lot of license is given specifically to Christians to do all sorts of things in schools, which they really shouldn't already be doing, like leading students in prayer before football games and things like that. Like there's already, for many young people in American schools, a significant amount of coercive pressure placed on them to engage in Christian worship in all sorts of informal ways. And then these outside groups are always trying to lobby for more and more influence over what happens in the classroom. And this should be seen within the context of this broader decades-long attempt to take over public education.
That's right. I think that's right. This isn't a religious freedom movement. It's a Christian nationalist movement, a Christian supremacist movement. There's no doubt about that at all. And, other liberal Christians know this as well. One of the most ironic, very much to be welcomed, but nonetheless ironic opponents of this is the Church of England in America. So the Church of England, obviously a proud provider of a third of our state-funded schools, almost a third of our state-funded schools in England, and a great defender in England of religious privilege, issued a statement in the US that said that the state funding of religious schools was an outrage, that it could never be allowed on grounds of freedom of religion.
That's marvelous.
I forget what they're called in the US. Is it Episcopalians?
Episcopalians.
And they had this long statement, where they were talking, secular talking points. It was fantastic. If only the Church of England here would learn from the their brothers and sisters in the US
on so many things.
But I think that's a good point, isn't it? Is that one of the things about secularism in the US, because it has been a religious freedom type of secularism rather than an anti-religious type of secularism, is that it does have many religious defenders, and we would hope to see more of those over time. Of course, that doesn't necessarily work. I remember in England in the early part of this century, 2001, 2, 3, when the government here was opening more state-funded religious schools because they wanted more state-funded religious schools of more different range of religions. There were a couple of denominations in particular that resisted. I think of Sikhs. Sikh organisations in the UK were very against this. But in the end, a Sikh school was opened. If you can't beat them, join them, seems to be the message of the Sikhs who did that. And principled religious opposition for secularism gets washed away. Religious groups seem to be very easily bought off with a share of privilege, even if it's a very small share when it comes to it. And I just hope that doesn't happen in the US over time.
It's a real shame because there are very strong religious reasons to oppose the state funding of religious organizations, particularly to provide education. I would think that a real priority of, for instance, Christian denominations would be the idea that the people who convert to them do so of their own free will. And it's a genuinely free choice to give one's life to Christ. And if there is a suggestion that actually it was, influenced by the school you happen to go to, or, because you wanted to go to the best funded school in your area and that happened to be a Catholic one, right? That is not exactly what I think of as a free religious choice. And you would think that Christians, particularly evangelical Christians, would want people to come to Christianity through evaluating whatever, the evidence, the reasons, their heart, but not considerations about what the state is funding. And that's one of the reasons why some of the earliest defenders of freedom of religion were deeply religious people. They thought it was very offensive that a government might attempt directly or indirectly to influence the conscience of its people. And this is exactly that. This is what would happen if the government starts handing out money to religious organizations to open schools.
Yeah, most secularists in history have been religious, of course. That's exactly right. And they've supported secular settlements in states for religious reasons. Like you say, Christians who don't think that the state should be getting between the individual and God, but also Muslims if they follow the idea that there shouldn't be any compulsion in religious conversion, Hindus who have a sort of pluralism built into their many of their convictions. I mean, these are all. There are many Buddhists, of course, obviously, but there are many religious sources of support for secularism, as well as it were, liberal humanist sources of support for secularism. And I think that you just have to hope that the liberals win.
As always, you said that this case had sparked in you thoughts about freedom in general and a humanist approach to freedom. What were those thoughts?
Well, I mean, I think because it obviously has such global analogues in other places. I mean, you see what's happening in India, you see what's happening in Turkey, you see what's happening in post-Arab Spring Middle East, North African states as well, and it does feel as if this is part of an unhappy tendency, unhappy trajectory in the world right now. Don't you think so? That freedom is sort of,
Yes.
and I think that even what we mean by freedom, it wasn't straightforward. The discussion we had a few moments ago about why secularism is in fact, genuinely to do with freedom and equality and so on. It wasn't easy to unpack that. It wasn't easy to rehearse those principles. It wasn't easy to explain, and so I do think it's worrying. The worry is that those arguments aren't as easily made these days.
I think something I read recently suggested that one of the challenges that liberal democracies are going through is that there are fewer and fewer people who have a personal experience of living in an illiberal state. And therefore they don't really understand the value of the legal, cultural, political structures that are giving them certain freedoms. And I do think there might be something to that, in the sense that it is, as you say, quite difficult to articulate what feels like quite an abstract reason why the state shouldn't give money to particular groups, etc., or why it's important to protect the sorts of curriculum that students learn in schools. And it becomes very clear to people if, for instance, they're a member of a religious minority and they have to go to a school that doesn't teach that religion, or if they the time when there was a whole spate of courthouses in the United States that were putting the 10 Commandments outside of them. And if you're a Muslim and you're just about to get a civil matter resolved in court, and you go to the court and there's a massive 10 Commandments outside, and your opponent in the case is a Christian, you're not exactly going to feel like you're going to get a fair hearing necessarily. But you only experience that if you're on the outside of the majority culture. But if you're on the inside, you don't feel it impinging upon you yet. And I wonder whether it's just a very difficult argument to make to people who benefit actually from this sort of thing. I mean, they benefit, they think, because they get their religion taught, right? And they get an education that's in their mind closer to what they want for their children.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And you're right that people with the same belief in a situation where they're a minority are great. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church is a great defender of secularism in countries that aren't majority Catholic. They're not such great defenders of it in countries where Catholics are majority. So I think that there is something about needing to be a minority, or at least to have at the very least, some folk memory of being unfree in order to really get the point of freedom. And we're talking about freedom of religion or belief, or civic freedom of religion or belief. But I think it's probably true of any sort of freedom, really. And I suppose the word we're looking for is complacency, really. People can become extremely complacent in these situations. And the only lessons to draw on are the lessons of history, I suppose. You can say, to some extent, you can say, well, look what happens in other parts of the world where, there is restrictions on freedom, or restrictions on where we have unsecular situations or whatever. Or you could say, well, look at what happened in the past when we had these restrictions, and they're the only examples you can reach for once living memory has ceased to be a factor. A bit like fascism, like we
Yes.
discussed before, and I thought about this week in VE Day as well.
Yeah.
VE Day, that's something we could have talked about. That what is it that gave great impetus to anti-fascism for the last 80 years, and great impetus also to supporting the liberal world order and human rights and international cooperation? Well, it was a living memory of what had happened when those things had been neglected, or not valued in the way that they've, at least at the elite level, been valued since by governments and internationally. And I think once that living memory fades, you're in trouble. You've got to find better ways of defending these things. You can do it maybe through better civic education, better human rights education. You can do it by trying to embed freedom into other institutions, whether it's schools or trade unions or other institutions that people might get their schooling in, their democratic schooling, their freedom schooling in. But it's very difficult otherwise.
And I think that it's another reason why this case is particularly important, because it involves education.
Yes.
And because charter schools have more flexibility about what they teach and how they teach, and because it's already a context in the United States where what is taught in state schools is highly politicized. There are already school boards all across the country taken over by really quite right-wing people with very, very unusual, to many of our eyes, ideas about what young people should and shouldn't be taught. Already swathes of books taken out of school libraries and not allowed to be taught in them. Already the sense that the current administration wants a very particular, limited version of American history to be taught, no DEI content, which means, stripping even government agencies of elements of their own history about women in the military, black people in the military, gay people in the military, and stuff like that. And in that context, this seems even more scary, because if it is important to teach every generation the importance of protecting the sorts of values that VE Day was remembering and upholding, then it gets more difficult in a climate where governments like to use state education to replicate their own political and religious views and to try and impose them on the populace. And it just makes the next generation less able to access the things that they need to fight back against these things. It becomes a spiral.
I think we should talk about VE Day. I know we didn't have a second thing to talk about this week, but I think we should talk about it.
Then let's talk about it. We've got 15 minutes.
Have we? Okay. So I was...
Andrew, tell people what VE Day is, because there may be some young listeners who never know what it is, or even older listeners who don't know what it is.
VE Day is Victory in Europe Day, which is the day 8th of May in 1945. Yeah, that's it exactly. When I think it was Germany was the only country left by then. I think maybe Italy had already surrendered. But when the German High Command and the Admiral, who was then, after the suicide of Hitler, representing the German state, signed the Act of Surrender, unconditional surrender, and brought the Second World War in Europe to an end. And so it's celebrated, of course, been commemorated. On the day, of course, it was a great surge of relief. I remember my grandparents describing to me just how a great weight was lifted from them. It was an enormous relief. They had hope. They had new courage. They were fortified by this occasion, and they felt obviously that fascism had been defeated, this great evil. And so on that day, there was great rejoicing, and ever since it's been commemorated. And of course, this year it was the 80th anniversary of VE Day. And so it was celebrated again, and in a very poignant way, as these big anniversaries are. 70. It was the same sort with the 70th, and then the 75th, and now the 80th. You're very much aware that there are a handful of people remaining alive who have it, like we were saying, in their actual memory rather than in their cultural memory. And they're very elderly. I saw some of them at some of the celebrations this week just gone. Very elderly now, very frail. So it was moving, as it always is, but I was also particularly struck this year by a sort of emptiness at the heart of some of the celebrations, because for the first time, I suppose it's because of the state of the world now, I thought, is there a bit too much red, white, and blue and Britain versus the Germans here, and not enough open society defeats fascism here? What lessons are people drawing when we commemorate something, when we mark an anniversary? We're not doing it, we're not saying something about the past as much as we're saying something about the present. We're saying this is something worth remembering. This is something to which we attach importance and meaning and significance. Now, me personally, what I've always attached, the meaning I've attached to these sorts of celebrations, very much like I feel going to the National Remembrance Ceremony every year at the Cenotaph. What I always feel there is like, well, I feel something about freedom and democracy and the rule of law and human rights and the wars that were fought, of which this is the most obvious and, as it were, purest example, the wars that were fought to defend those good things and against racism, fascism, authoritarianism, the dark values of a closed society. And I felt, the world being what it is at the moment, this was really a year when we could have done with learning some of those lessons and having them foregrounded, but I didn't feel that they were. I mean, I wrote something about it last week, which I didn't put out. I just published it on my own website, not anywhere else, sort of saying that, VE Day wasn't the end of something. It was just one moment in an ongoing struggle against closed society thinking, authoritarianism, fascism, which we see all around us in the world today. And I think that was sort of lost. And I also worry that the wrong lessons were brought out even when these things were alluded to. So, for example, I was invited to go with some other non-Christians to the Westminster Abbey national ceremony. As many people will know, England remains a Christian state, and so the Church of England is given enormous power to frame and memorialise these things, and sometimes they exercise it with a measure of inclusiveness. I've been to things at Westminster Abbey that are sort of, people of all religions and beliefs and get together. But the Archbishop of York gave what I can only describe as a deranged address from the pulpit in Westminster Abbey, when he talked about godless Nazism and how Judeo-Christian values had destroyed godless Nazism. And
he didn't.
He did. And I was
I am shook.
It was really shocking.
I didn't know that.
It was really shocking. It wasn't, I tried to look for it afterwards to see if it had been recorded, and I suppose it must be recorded somewhere, but it's not on the website, the BBC. And I thought, this what a terrible lesson to draw from this. How distorted that was. And it just made me think, yeah, we're really learning the wrong lessons from this, and we're not fortifying ourselves in the ways that we need to prevent these sorts of things from happening again. So I felt that very strongly about this VE Day. Maybe people who listen to this, if anyone listens to this, might like to read that article online. But that's what I think about VE Day. I think it's something worth talking about.
Andrew, we have tens of listeners.
It's the same one. It's your
Yes.
it's your mother. No, on the
probably is just on repeat in the background of everything she does. No, people do listen to this, and even
good.
so, it's important to put it out there, because I think you're exactly right. I feel like maybe there was a sense of complacency in. I don't want to get into I don't know. Do I want to talk about the liberal establishment? I don't know. Maybe I do. I feel like maybe there is a sense of complacency, the sense that, we won, that battle is over. But you're right. It's a constant battle against the most wicked parts of our nature, which don't go away. And they can always be roused by demagogues and people who play to our fears and our irrationality and our desire for strength and to win, our passion for competition and victory. And it's sad that you feel like this ceremonial occasion, which could be used if it was sensitively approached to bring out the values that we still need to resist what is happening again in the world today, was instead a sort of missed opportunity, and this sounds a little bit like a sort of empty ritual that's forgotten why it's actually important.
Well, I don't think it was empty for the Archbishop of York. I think he was saying that we all had to follow Jesus. I mean, right at the end of his address, he said, Jesus is the way. So I think the problem there was not that it was empty, but it was full of the wrong stuff. I mean, he was trying to say it was Judeo-Christian values and that defeated godless Nazism. Never mind that, most Nazis were Christians and, you know, godless organizations were the first ones banned by the Third Reich when, Hitler gave his speech saying he'd stamp out atheism for good and all the rest of it. And we don't even need to rehearse the many reasons why the Archbishop of York was factually and historically wrong. But even saying that, the values of our Judeo-Christian tradition, which is what he said, were the ones that were needed, and that he wanted to remind everyone that Jesus was the way. I mean, that was the problem, that it was full of the wrong stuff, and that this was the state commemoration. So the meaningful things that the British state had to say about VE Day were apparently that it was Jesus who would light the way, and the Nazis were godless, and all those terrible things that happened were basically because of that. That was the quite shocking thing. I mean, he made some side references to, of course, these good Christian values are shared by other people of other religions and beliefs, but generally it was pretty shocking. And I think that I mean, maybe you're right, a failure of liberals there might be the failure to stand confidently by a statement of values that is not. I mean, that might be one of the reasons. We've spoken before about the way that this weird claim that everything good comes from Christianity, or that all the nice things in our society are Christian, which is weird, ahistorical, sort of nonsensical claim, has become very prominent recently. And I suppose it might be because there's a sort of cultural insecurity in how we're going to face up to the threats that are coming along, and therefore politicians and others are sort of resorting to whoever is around hawking their religious wares, and churches are just very powerful and prominent and around, and so they can offer something up even though it's not true. I suppose that's attributable to two things then, isn't it? The stridency of churchmen who want to make that point, and then also the silence of liberal humanists in expressing our values to say, well, look, here is the real shared basis for moving forward. But if the BBC won't broadcast you, and newspapers won't cover it, and there's a lot of the third richest institution in the world, or whatever the Church of England is pumping it out, then I suppose it's a bit of an unequal fight. But I don't think that Christian values are what are going to save us from future fascism, future authoritarianism, and future closed societies. Far from it. So I think we better try and promote better values pretty quickly.
I entirely agree with you. In fact, in case our listeners are interested, I participated in a debate discussion with Christian evangelist Glenn Scrivener just this week, and it's already on YouTube. You can seek it out. I will link it in the episode notes for this video, but it was on the topic, is Christianity the air we breathe? And it was exactly about this argument of whether all that's good in contemporary culture comes from Christianity. And Glenn said yes, and I said no, it's a bit more complicated than that. There's a lot of other influences. And we had a really good, this is like a 2-hour video, so we had a good discussion with a lot of questions, a lot of people there, so there's clearly interest in the topic. And I don't know how well I did. Maybe you can go watch the video and comment and see, because most of the comments under it are clearly from Christians who thought Glenn did a great job. So it'll be nice to get some support in the comment threads there, but take a look at that. I have to say though, Andrew, I'm really quite shocked. I'm wondering why it is, you think, that people like the Archbishop of York, who presumably are intelligent, thoughtful people, wouldn't actually aren't self-aware enough to think things like, oh, is what I'm saying actually true? And is what I'm saying actually helpful to create a concerted societal respect for these values that I think are important? Is what I'm saying inclusive of the many people in the United Kingdom who are not religious and don't believe in God? Like, if I was in that position, not that I ever will be, to ask to deliver an address at an important civic ceremony like that, I would ask myself those questions. So why isn't he?
I agree.
I think I might seek out that sermon for Hate Watch
if
Oh.
you can find it online, maybe he's been cancelled. I doubt it, unfortunately.
No, I don't think so. But at least he wasn't elected Pope.
No,
And
not this
neither was Donald Trump,
time. Oh, what a disappointment for him.
even though he put himself forward. Well, that is it for another episode of Deep Humanism. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you.
And I'll see you in the depths.